Okay, everybody, now we are going to start the first thematic session. I would like to remind our speakers that they have a maximum of 20 minutes for their presentation, with 30 minutes allotted for panel discussion and Q&A session. The first session will address an overview of cybercrime. We have invited three distinguished scholars in this field: Professor Michael McGuire of University of Surrey in the UK, Dr. Seokbom Kim, researcher of Utica College in the United States, and Professor Yoonshik Jang of Hallym University in Korea. Now, let's have first speaker, Professor Michael McGuire. Professor McGuire has got a PhD degree from King's College of London, and he is currently working as a senior lecturer in criminology of University of Surrey. He worked as a chair of European Society of Criminology Working Group on Politics, Science, and Technology. He is also a member of International Interdisciplinary Research Consortium on Cybercrime. His topic today is Rethinking Cybercrime, the Evolution of a Digital Deviance Within a Digital Economy. Professor McGuire, you have the floor.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this talk at the KIC International Forum, which is about definitions of cybercrime, conceptualizations of cybercrime, and I'm going to talk about that challenge in relation to some research I've done recently about the way that cybercriminals generate revenues and function within kind of what I call a cybercrime economy. The challenge of defining cybercrime in a way seems like it's gone away. We all sort of think we know what cybercrime is, and I've argued against that. I think there's a number of challenges with how we define and explain cybercrime, and here's three that I've flagged up for you. First of all, there are the fundamental conceptual and definitional problems. Do we have a universalist approach? Do we try and think that there's a definition of cybercrime that covers all kinds of cybercrimes? Or do we think we can only apply certain definitions, the particularist approach, to particular cybercrimes? Or thirdly, do we just think that the whole exercise is a waste of time? We're agnostic about it, we're skeptical about it, and we think let's just not bother about defining cybercrime, let's just get on with policing it and enforcing it. Second related challenge is then, if we do come up with a definition that we're satisfied with, to what extent does that fit with the evidence? Is the way that we define cybercrime something that cybercriminals are actually doing? Finally, thirdly, is our definition, is our conceptualization of any use? Can we apply it on the ground to specific activities that cybercriminals are engaged in? And does it help us make sense or do something about it? And indeed, what are the connections here? Really, with cybercrime, we've got a fundamental challenge. Do we go with the fact that cybercrime appears to use technology and that the technology is fundamental to it, or do we try and get around that and come up with a non-technological definition? Here's one example of something I did in my work a few years ago, where I tried to develop a non-technological definition. And this focuses on the idea that as with the idea of cyberspace, there's something spatial going on. And that spatiality comes from the kinds of connections that the internet and digital technologies enable us to engage in. In fact, there are so many of these connections, whether it is to what we're saying, how we talk to people, how we access data, that many people now talk about the idea of hyperconnectedness, hyperconnection. We're in a hyperconnected world. And just as we used to think that engaging with computers created cyberspace, maybe hyperconnection, hyperconnectedness creates a kind of a hyperspace, in which case we derive then a nice little definition in the same way as cybercrime comes from cyberspace. Maybe we can think about hypercrime coming from hyperspace. Well, personally, I think this is a good and profitable direction to go on. But of course, most people don't use the concept of hypercrime. They still talk about cybercrime. So it looks like we're kind of stuck with the term, and it looks like, therefore, we're stuck with a kind of technological definition. So when we think about the technologically driven definition of cybercrime, what we kind of think about is things like cybercrime is the misuse of computers. That's certainly how it used to be defined, or maybe it's a misuse of digital technology. But there's a number of problems there with that, aren't there, once we start to drill down a bit. Is it computers, as people used to think, or is it, as people increasingly realized, it was about the network rather than the computer? Can we even talk about computers? Are computers the same kind of thing now as they were in the 1990s when cybercrime began to emerge? With cloud computing and so on, the computer as a device is increasingly less central. So is it about the network, or is it about other developments of the network, such as wireless technologies and new developments coming down the line? In other words, we have a device impermanence. The technology we use to define cybercrime is constantly changing, and that's not a good thing for conceptions and definitions. We want these to be, particularly if we want to be universal about them, we want to be permanent. Second problem is related to what does this technology do and how does it function within the definition? What kind of agency do we as human actors have in using the technology, or is it all the technology that does the job? And how do we cause anything? Is it us causing something, or is it the device? And if it's the device causing it, then what relevance do we as human actors have? And some of you might be familiar with this challenge in one of the standard definitions of cybercrime, which relates to it as computer-dependent crime, distribution of malware, viruses, and so on, or cyber-enabled crime, things like fraud, online sexual offending, and so on. There's this big schism, this big conceptual divide, which I don't think really has been successfully bridged yet. Is cybercrime computer-dependent, or is cybercrime computer-enabled? And that leads us to the third problem, the third challenge with a technological definition, which is right back with us, human actors. How do we account for human factors? How do we account for the role of the social world in our definition of cybercrime if technology is playing such a central definitional role? So how do we incorporate these human social factors into our definitions at the same time as avoiding what's sometimes called technological determinism, everything being decided by the technology? Well, in the research that I did, I tried to respond to this challenge by looking at what cybercriminals actually did. And one of the things that they do, clearly most frequently, is try and make money, try and generate revenues. So starting from this point of revenue generation, it looked like it could answer the three challenges that I mentioned earlier on. It seems like it might be a universal definition. It would enable us to map cybercrime activity as a whole. Seems like it could also be particular, because it would tell us about what individual cyber criminals are doing at any given offending moment. They're motivated by acquiring some value or some benefit to themselves. And finally, it does seem to have an applied dimension. If revenue generation is what's fundamental to cybercrime, then maybe we could use that to intervene, to disrupt revenue networks and revenue flows. So the research this was based on is called the Web of Profit. There was 3 reports here. I won't go into all of them now because of time. The first report, the Web of Profit itself, looked at the cybercrime economy, how much it generates. The second report looked at the role of certain elements of this economy, which is social media platforms. How do they generate money? How do they enable cyber criminals? And then the third report looked at perhaps the more familiar aspect of what cyber criminals do in terms of hidden markets, the dark market, the invisible net, and so on. We used a variety of different methodologies for this piece of research. There was interviews that we conducted, some of it with actually convicted cyber criminals, and they told us how they were spending money and generating their money, practitioners and so on. We did a lot of observation. We looked at different social media platforms, both in Europe and the West and Russia and China, which I think is a very important unexplored area of cybercrime activity. We looked at what was going on a sample of 15 darknet platforms over a specified time period. And we actually engaged with some of the vendors on those platforms, trying to do transactions, try and buy and sell things. And then finally, we analyzed a lot of the data that we had, things like commodities that were being sold on darknet markets, what prices they were reaching. And then we looked at a whole variety of other bits of data and tried to find some patterns in that: social media posts, uploads, photos, and so on. What we found was very complex, and there were many, many things that I could talk about here, but since we have very limited time, I'm going to talk about 2 things which could be specifically related to the question of definition. The first one is, as I've kind of suggested, that revenue generation seems to suggest within cybercrime the emergence of something we can think of as a cybercrime economy. And that points to the second finding, which is the need to develop a much better socio-economic conception in our definitions of cybercrime. So the cybercrime economy clearly is a dynamic, it's an economy of flows, as the theorist Manuel Castells once described it, the digital economy. It involves generating revenues. These revenues are then moved around in different ways. They're laundered, they're spent, and in turn, they are reinvested sometimes in cybercrime, sometimes in other kinds of crime, things, concerning things like terrorism. So it's a dynamic, flowing thing, and our definitions of cybercrime have to reflect that inherent dynamism, I think. Like any economy, it's got certain fundamental features. Now, in our industrial or in industrial and service economies, we think about raw materials like metal and steel and coal, and they get fed into the economy, and from them they're turned into other things and wealth results. Well, of course, in the digital economy, and the cybercrime economy is part of that, has its very, very own and unique raw material data. And that might be everything from the kind of company databases you can buy on the dark net, through to things like loyalty points, likes and dislikes on social media sites. They're all things that can be traded in, that can be bought and sold, along with more familiar examples such as our personal identification details. Like any economy, there are many ways in which wealth is generated. All economies are about wealth generation. The cybercrime economy, when you start to look at it, it's really surprising just how many ways now. It's not just simple data theft any longer. There's all kinds of ways in which cybercriminals can make money. So yes, they steal data and they trade in data, they buy and sell data, but they also do things like they buy tools and they sell tools. They use their cybercrime skills and online resources to generate a huge volume of trade in things like counterfeit goods, prescription pharmaceuticals, illegal drugs, and so on. There is a trade in the buying and selling of skills, using consultancy to improve your botnet or whatever it might be. There is a dedicated currency, which I'll come on to in a minute, which is bought and sold. And there is a trade in things like company secrets, intellectual property. There is money made from extortion, and so on. I could cite many other examples. But all of this is rooted, again, as I just suggested, in a kind of a currency. And currencies are fundamental to economies. Economies can't function unless there is a fluidity of exchange of value through transactions and buying and selling and so on. And of course, the digital economy, and increasingly the cybercrime economy, trades on these digital currencies now, whether it's digital payment systems, whether it's peer-to-peer banking, and the hundreds really now of cryptocurrencies that now exist. The example of how important they are, it's estimated that around about $2.8 billion were money laundered over Bitcoin exchanges last year. That's a doubling from the previous year. So the currency element of the cybercrime economy is absolutely fundamental, but there are many, many other features as well. We all know about darknet markets and dark web situations. So these are dedicated marketplaces. Familiar economies, the legitimate economy, we think about things like the stock market, like other kinds of marketplaces, online marketplaces like eBay, Amazon, and so on. Well, cybercrime has got its own examples. It's also got supply centers, where raw materials are processed and developed into wealth-generating commodities. And this example here of this famous Romanian village is sometimes referred to as Hackerville. There's a huge hacker economy here that's been reported. How big is this economy? Well, we measured it to be valued at around $1.5 trillion annually. And that's a conservative estimate for lots and lots of reasons, which I haven't got time to go into here. But that's a staggering amount of money. It breaks down kind of as follows, in ways which we found a little bit surprising in the research. Actually, the biggest component of this economy is the trading that's done across illegal online markets with things like counterfeit goods, pharmaceuticals, and so on. About $860 billion per annum that's worth. Trade secret IP theft, about $500 billion. Trading in data, surprisingly not quite so much, $160 billion, right down to things like crimeware, which of course we associate as a paradigmatic cybercrime good, actually generating a lot less money than perhaps the less obvious types of activity within this economy. The fact that there's so much money being generated within the cybercrime economy, I think, has to be seen as something very significant. I mean, for example, just as a comparison, we can see that it generates more money than the combined revenues of the top 3 Fortune 500 companies. It generates, amount of wealth and revenues, which is larger than the GDP of many nation states, including states, wealthy states like Saudi Arabia. And perhaps more importantly, it generates a huge amount of resources. And that means that new cyber criminals are constantly coming into the field because they want a piece of the action. It allows, as I've suggested, quite a significant volume of money to be reinvested back into cybercrime and crime. It blends with the legitimate economy and distorts it in ways which I'll come back to in a minute. And as a result, it fosters the interest of other larger actors, amongst them nation states, to get involved in cybercrime. So the idea of the fact that the legitimate economy becomes blurred with the cybercrime economy, I think is something that's very significant, and we're only beginning to make sense of this. I mean, money laundering, I've already mentioned. The fact that there's huge amounts of money being laundered in the world. Increasingly, a lot of that comes from the cybercrime economy, and increasingly, legitimate actors like banks. We know the famous case with HSBC, the global laundromat scandal that took place a couple of years ago when HSBC was found to be involved in enabling laundering on a global scale. So the cybercrime economy, as it grows, is distorting the legitimate economy and making actually the boundary between crime and non-crime harder to trace. And one of the ways in which this blurring is taking place is by a new kind of cybercrime tool. And I'm writing a book about this at the moment called Platform Criminality. And this is the digital platform. Many people, and for example, the writer Nick Chernikek has written a book called Platform Capitalism. And he suggests that just as, say, generation of industrial goods in the early industrial revolution was one of the big ways in which wealth was generated. Now, the most money being generated in the legitimate economy comes from digital platforms like Facebook, like Amazon, like eBay, and so on. And we have a range of platforms in the cybercrime world, whether it's darknet markets, whether it's other sort of personal forums that cybercriminals use to buy and sell goods. The platform becomes a new kind of cybercrime tool. And with it becomes, from a criminological perspective, I think a very, very interesting development in that crime is no longer the primary activity for cybercriminal for generating wealth. There's a first order level of crime, perhaps where data is stolen or a hack is done, but then the commodities generated from that go into this wider economy, and you get a kind of what I call second order criminality, a trading of crime upon crime. And I think this is a historic change in the nature of what crime and criminality is. So to conclude, last couple of slides, what should we do and how does this cybercrime economy affect how we define cybercrime? Well, one approach is, as I highlighted in the beginning of the talk, to take what might be called the skeptical agnosticist approach. Say, we don't do anything, who cares? All we can do is get on with identifying what cyber criminals do and helping law enforcement then disrupt that. You could go to another end of the scale and say, well, look, actually, this is so significant, we've got to throw out our old definitions of cybercrime completely and come up with something new, maybe a kind of a hypercrime type idea. Or perhaps what it means is that cybercrime will increasingly be defined in terms of its particular activities, the particularist approach. So what we will get is a kind of a fragmented field of cybercrime, which certain activities are foregrounded over others. So you have the kind of economic, financial cybercrime, which I've been talking about in this discussion, which of course is by far the largest, generates the largest volume of cybercrime activity and the most revenues. But then you have other types of activity that we're also concerned about, other ways in which online digital technology cause harm, such as sexual cybercrime, perhaps, hate speech online, hate-based cybercrime, and so on. This could be one future for how we define cybercrime, to fragment it into these different definitions. Or, to conclude, it may be, and this is something that I think a lot of people have considered, that cybercrime or digital technology becomes such a fundamental activity, or such a fundamental tool for criminals to use, that actually there's no difference between crime and cybercrime any longer. Every crime, to some extent, is enabled by digital technology, whether you're planning, a bank robbery by talking to somebody over the internet, whether you're using 3D copiers to make guns and getting plans and blueprints for over the internet. Maybe at every level in the next 10 to 15 years, digital crime is going to permeate crime in general, so that we won't need a definition of cybercrime at all. Either way, the question of definition and the question of conceptualization, which is often forgotten about when we think about cybercrime, because we are very target fixated, we are very fixated on measuring what cyber criminals are doing. I'd like to conclude by just reminding all of us that we shouldn't forget that defining cybercrime is fundamental to how we think about cybercrime. If we don't get that right, then we might as well forget the whole business from square one. Thank you very much for listening to this talk, and I shall look forward to answering some of your questions when you put them forward to me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. McGuire, for sharing very interesting research findings with us, and also new suggestion about the definition of a cybercrime by emerging digital economy into that definition. And it was very interesting for the suggestion that incorporating a more developed economic dimension into our conceptualization of cybercrime. Personally, I heard a lot very interestingly. More discussion will follow in the panel discussion session. Now, let's have our second speaker. Our second presentation is given by Dr. Seokbum Kim. Dr. Seokbum Kim is Research Associate of Student Computer Forensics and Digital Evidence Educational Opportunities Program, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the U.S. Department of Justice. He has earned a PhD degree at the University of Massachusetts Lowell with a major of criminology and justice studies. He worked at the Public Safety Division of Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency. His main research areas are quantitative methods and statistics, theories of crime, policing, victimology, data intelligence analysis, cybercrime, and comparative criminology. His topic that he is going to present today is on the metric of cybercrime. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. This is Dr. Seokbum Kim. So today I'm gonna briefly talk about some general issues about measuring cybercrime. Like a definition of a cybercrime, what kind of cybercrime data has been measured, and at what level has a cybercrime data has been collected, who is the victim of a cybercrime, how reliable is the cybercrime data. Then we will discuss about the metrics of cybercrime. So based on Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey, two important sources of crime data in the United States, a commonly accepted fact is that the rate of serious violent crime and property crime has shown a downward trend. As you can see in the graph, the South Korea also see a downward trend in offline crime. However, the official index crime rates has been criticized, failing to capture the reality of the crime directly or indirectly related to cyberspace. So with the development of ICT, criminals have an opportunity to change their modus operandi. Therefore, traditional offline crimes like fraud, stalking, and harassment evolved into the new form of cybercrime, even drug crimes. For example, according to the DEA in the United States, criminals use the dark web to sell illegal drugs over eBay-like illicit market. These transactions are usually made using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. The ordered drugs are shipped via international packages. As a result, some experts warned about a new phase of opioid epidemic in the US. So another example is that the annual number of sensitive digital data breaches have surged, along with increasing financial losses incurred by such breaches. Again, the current official crime data did not capture these types of crime. Maybe little evidence exists so far about crime migration from offline to online. However, the lack of cybercrime data hinders our understanding of addressing the evolving nature of cybercrime. So generally, the importance of robust measurement and collection of cybercrime data is related to accurately defined crime problems. Also, we can inform and aware the public regarding the criminal victimization. From a law enforcement perspective, accurate cyber data can justify obtaining funding and resources to address cybercrime. The first is about the definition of cybercrime. Earlier, Dr. McGuire addressed this issue beautifully, so I make a very quick thinking about the definitions of cybercrime. So, as a former law enforcement, it is very difficult to establish a specific definition of a cybercrime. Cybercrime, computer crime, computer-enabled crime, all these terms are used interchangeably, but there is no settled definition of cybercrime. This makes a lot of confusion about law enforcement work. Therefore, the interpretation of cybercrime differ from academic or professional point of view and from country by country. So, as Dr. McGuire says, we need to more effort to establish the settled definition of cybercrime. The second issue is about what kind of cyber data we are collecting. In the United States, among the 52 NIVRS Group A offenses, so-called the most serious offenses, only one category listed under fraud offenses called hacking and computer invasion is only designated for cybercrime. In contrast, South Korea law enforcement maintained more detailed categorization and classification. Because it is very difficult to add or change crime category in the official data does not easily adapt to new cybercrime such as ransomware or sextortion. In this regard, South Korea official data is more responsive to the current cybercrime trend. The victimization survey is an important tool for estimating cybercrime. Especially, it can measure unreported cybercrime, so-called hidden crime, and threat or risk of cybercrime. Also, due to the flexibility of the survey contents, it is possible to capture the current trend of cybercrime without any regulation. So we need to more focus on how to use the victimization survey to capture the current cybercrime trend. A second issue is about at what level has data been collected so far. In South Korea, victims of cybercrime voluntarily report their incidents to the police. This initial reporting consists of approximately 80% of entire received cybercrime cases in South Korea. After initial investigation, about 56% of received crime reports were classified as official crime. Therefore, local, regional, and national crime statistics can be collected through a centralized police system in South Korea. In contrast, in the U.S., there's a very little is known about the level of the data collection method in the U.S. In the U.S., local, regional, and national cybercrime statistics can be collected through NIVRS, but very limited to certain crime like hacking and the fraud crime, as mentioned earlier. In the US, the most important thing is that jurisdictional issues are the most difficult to solve. Many cybercrimes are committed out of state or internationally. Some states has broadened their jurisdiction rules, but it is very difficult to prosecute cybercrime criminals outside the state. So for example, the total cybercrime handled by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office for the last 3 years is only 17 cases. This number was surprisingly low. These features hinder the understanding of the extent and the prevalence of cybercrime. The next issue of cybercrime is related to counting the occurrence of cybercrime. In 2017, the hacking incidents of Equifax, one of the 3 largest consumer credit reporting agencies in the US, exposed almost half of the American credentials like Social Security number, driver license number, and credit card number. The question arises from whether we should consider these data breaches as one incident or 147.9 million cases. Precisely who is the victim of data breach caused by hacking is very difficult to handle with. The crime occurrence rate largely depends on the method of counting. So we should dive into this type of counting issue more and more. The final issue is about the reality of the cybercrime data, reliability of the cybercrime data. As you can see in trend, the use of a smartphone and the number of forensic service requests seems to be correlated with each other. But the official cybercrime data in South Korea seems to be a little bit fluctuate year by year. This fluctuation might be related to the reporting system. As we already saw just before, the reported cybercrime was initially reviewed or consulted by a police officer. During this process, a substantial amount of reported cybercrime was excluded for the subsequent criminal investigation. So this, in the future, this kind of initial filtering process of the Korean police should be regulated by some kind of objective guidelines. Regarding US NIVRS, it is reported that only approximately 44% of local law enforcement joined the NRBRS system. Furthermore, FBI acknowledged that NIBRS is estimated to cover only 12% of cybercrime. When we interviewed a patrol officer in Massachusetts, they acknowledged that cybercrime like cyber stalking was not included in the crime data simply because there is no NIBRS code for cyber stalking. So the NIBRS system allows for coding when the crime takes place in cyberspace. Nevertheless, it is very difficult to detect a full range of cybercrime within NIBRS system. So we need to regarding the measuring cybercrime, the need to define, categorize, and track cybercrime is imperative. We can consider to develop so-called index cybercrime to measure and compare cybercrime across countries. And it is necessary to consider a way of complementing cybercrime official data based on victimization survey so that each source of cybercrime can be used to solve problems that the other cannot. So thank you for listening to my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kim. I would like to add that this presentation is actually based on the research collaboration between the KIC and KOSCA, which is Korean Society of Criminology in America. And I recognize Dr. Kim's and your research team's effort to kind of delve into the measurement issues of cybercrime, which sounds really difficult to define and also measure across the different jurisdictions. And I want to actually hear about the panel discussion. In the panel discussion, the discussants, opinion about setting the index crime in the cybercrime. Okay, so more discussion will follow in the panel discussion. Okay, so we're going to move into the third presentation. The third presentation, which is the last presentation of this session, is given by Professor Yoon-sik Jang. Professor Jang is Assistant Professor of Legal Informatics and Forensic Science, School of Global Studies, Hallym University. He started his career as a Korean National Police and lectured as a police professor and director of International Cybercrime Research Center at Korean National Police University. Since 2015, he has been a professor of Hallym University and director of Institute of Legal Informatics and Forensic Science there. His major research interests are cybercrime and policing, digital forensic investigation, and law enforcement training. The topic that he's going to present today is key issues in cybercrime capacity building. Dr. Jang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Yoon, for the cordial introduction. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Yoon-sik Jang. I'm working for Legal Informatics and Forensic Science, focusing cybercrime and digital forensics in Hallym University, which is in Chuncheon City. I'm very grateful to the KICIF for allowing me to speak in this international forum for cybercrime. What I'm going to talk about today is the key issues in cybercrime capacity building, especially focusing on law enforcement. Criminal justice has a primary responsibility to handle criminal matters. It may include prevention, mitigation, detection, investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of crime and criminals, though cybercrime is not an exception. To do those jobs properly, criminal justice agents need different tools, capabilities, especially for cybercrime they have never experienced before. So easily, capacity building in criminal justice or cybercrime capacity, shortly CCB hereafter for myself, became a focus of national cybercrime policies, open cybersecurity policies more broadly. Since around 2000, there have been a lot of international CCP programs and projects to reduce the capacity gaps among countries. Some of them were conducted as a part of international development cooperation among donors and recipients. Today, I would focus more on the issues in the CCP programs which are implemented between developed and developing country relations. Unfortunately, regarding time constraint, let me skip some slides. For example, this is prepared to distinguish the cyber crime matters from other cyber agendas. We discussed cybercrime definition so far, focusing to distinguish from other crimes, but one thing we have to address is cybercrime should be distinguished from other cyber agendas, including cybersecurity, something like that. So, but it's too long, so let me skip it. Okay, sorry for that. Simply put, capacity building is to be armed with organizational and individual capabilities to solve problems, including physical infrastructure and equipment, knowledge and skills, and other resources. One definition of CCB was proposed by the Council of Europe, saying cybercrime capacity building is enabling criminal justice authorities to meet the challenge of cybercrime and electronic evidence. See, it's about criminal justice of authorities, it's about cybercrime, but it's also about electronic evidence. Not all digital evidence is for cybercrime, but more for non-cybercrime. Anyway, most of all, the deficit of law enforcement capacity against cybercrime and e-evidence have been complained a lot, as you know. One thing to stress is that in the context of international development, the focus have been moved from physical and financial infrastructure to human resources development and organizational and institutional development for the last decades. Simply do not buy something for them, rather teach them, rather change their society and organization. That is a reflection of experiences in the international development cooperations. And now, what would be CCB for law enforcement agencies? As organizations, many of law enforcement agencies are named police. That is, the law enforcement is just the police. But in terms of functionalities, law enforcement and policing might be different. Law enforcement is focused on investigation and punishment and deterrence through them. As you know, classical criminological theory focuses on deterrence by reactive punishment. Policing is regulation for maintenance of order, especially for crime prevention. Some police theories focuses more on the anticipating and proactive prevention measures. We may think of community policing, problem-oriented policing, and some more on this. Without doubt, the police do policing in conventional fashion. But how about the cyberspace? What the police do on cyberspace for the purpose of policing? Does police regulate internet access and activities? Is the case? So one problem is to decide what to do against the cybercrime on cyberspace and the role of law enforcement agencies when considering CCB plans, especially in network of cybersecurity. To illustrate my point more, let me introduce the case of Korean police. As you know, Korea is quite advanced in ICT, and now cyber policing is a mainstream in police. They have cyber bureau separated from criminal investigation bureau. It's unlike the case of the most of jurisdictions. As of 2019, more than 11% of all crimes were categorized as cybercrime in Korea. and 1.5% of police forces are cyber police officers exclusively. To my knowledge, this is the ratio in the world. Since the establishment of Cyber Bureau and implementation of Cyber Safety Master Plan in 2013, Korean police prioritized cybercrime prevention. Many policies for cybercrime prevention have been implemented and evaluated. I introduced some preventive measures taken by Korean police using the situational crime prevention frameworks. The Korean police have qualified cybercrime prevention instructors. They actually teach in the school. We observed many young people carefully listen to cyber cops, get effective in raising cybercrime awareness. They have cyber neighborhood watch program as well. They developed several apps to alert and inform cybercrime and to receive cybercrime report. They received approximately 240,000 cybercrime reports using PC and mobile apps only in 2019. Quite remarkable numbers. This kind of the police activities are not common in most of jurisdictions out of Korea. Who and how do the police able to develop the better policies for cybercrime prevention? Again, I think the uniqueness of Korean police may demonstrate the diverse possibilities in developing cybercrime response activities, especially in my point, the CCB as well. So we sometimes may develop a best practice model for a complex job to illustrate the relation of elements of work to guarantee the best outputs and outcomes. Then we may develop a best practice model to illustrate the required organizational and individual elements and processes to solve cybercrime from the top to bottom. I drew the diagram to depict complexity among many different factors in considering CCB. In the top level, international and national dimension, governance, norm, principle, and other issues might be discussed. As you know, in some countries, free flow of information is important, but security is more important in other countries. In some countries, digital evidence exchange is more important, when sovereignty is more important in other countries. Some claims multi-stakeholderism, when others prefer intergovernmental approaches. Cybercrime and/or cybersecurity strategies may declare that what are value and principles to pursue, what are goals to achieve, what to do by whom, and so on. So, national cybersecurity strategies have been implemented in many countries, and international organizations publicized guidelines for development of cybersecurity strategies. In conventional cybercrime training focuses were in the lowest level activities, unfortunately. They learned how to identify criminals and analyze digital forensics, mostly for deterrence purposes. However, even though lack of macro level capacity might be more fundamental and serious, those issues have rarely discussed in the most of the training programs. Now, let me talk more about international cooperation for CCB. It's natural that the resource, knowledge, and skills are more seriously insufficient in developing countries. Considering the nature of borderless cybercrime and even to contribute the international development cooperation and law enforcement cooperation in general, CCB was easily selected as a theme for international cooperation. The need of CCB have been recognized in many international dialogues, even in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Based on international dialogues, there are a number of actual CCB activities, multilateral and bilateral. Multilateral activities are usually coordinated by international organizations, among others. I think the Council of Europe's CCB activities are the most active, requiring legislation based on Convention on Cybercrime. There are also bilateral programs. As just one example, we have a project between Bangladesh police and KICIF. KICIF is an agency responsible for international development grants in Korea. I mentioned about a best practice model framework for discussion. Then what elements would be included in national level CCB programs? A model, again, proposed by Council of Europe encompasses 12 areas for CCB. Among 12 areas, I think at least 10 of them, red colored in the slide, are closely related to the police. However, there are some inherent pitfalls in international cooperation. So most of all, it's costly, including travel costs, needless to say, and international cooperations are based on friendly relationship, which may make it very hard to criticize objectively. I think we don't have many researches and publications on the matter, somewhat because of it. Various participants and differences also make CCP cooperation difficult, even including language barrier. Let me talk more specifically in conventional cybercrime trainings. Trainees visit trainers' places to learn the best practices. Once trained, the trainees are expected to come back to their country and teach their people as a trainer with their own training program. We expect to teach fishing instead of feeding a person. However, the expectation is hardly realized. Many of trainings are the lack of so-called quality training. Many training programs are training and trainers are ad hoc, not well developed, not permanently residential. Many programs are so too short to teach unexperienced persons. In many cases, trainees are not qualified. In many cases, training pathway were not considered, which make incremental learning difficulty. In my experience, I met some officers who have never used computer mice by their hands before the training. In an international trainer program. And most of the training focuses on how low technical skills and they have a rare chance to have knowledge about managerial capability for cybercrime policing. Furthermore, I think there are more fatal organizational problems which may make all of the training effort insufficient. First, many officers, especially in developing countries, don't want to work in cybercrime unit. I heard some reasons from different countries, but I think it's not appropriate to mention the details. Even if any officers are well trained, it's common to fail in retention of the trained officers. Unlike expectation, teaching a trainer often doesn't contribute to organizational capacity enhancement because conversion of tacit knowledge of individual to exploited knowledge of organization is not well managed in developing countries. Sometimes we observe that the newly learned skill were misused mostly for political reasons. There are some efforts to address those issues I mentioned. One of them are to make training courses based on the competency standard required for jobs and positions. The diagram in the slide shows one of them. I think we need to develop much more to be implemented practically. I may know cybersecurity workforce, you may know cybersecurity workforce framework in the US, and we have Korean police's cybercrime competency standard model for entire police. Regardless of international standardization, we may need any of competency framework to adopt in CCP project in accordance with the recipient organization regulations. Now let me talk the recipient-based model that many projects adopted. In the model, different trainers visit the trainees and provide customized program to them. And so recently it's more prevalent. Required model is not best practice, but best fit model for recipient. If the provided model is not fit well in the recipient country, it wouldn't work as expected and it wouldn't be sustainable. The problem is that developing suitable CCP model for a recipient is an extremely hard job. Competency standard is just one of the problems we face. Again, for illustration, let me introduce Bangladesh-Korea CCP project between 2012 to 16. Grant size was approximately $3 million. Obviously, immediate expected output of the project were competent cybercrime unit for cyber investigation and digital forensics. Initially, there was a goal to general IT training capability. The goal has been eliminated later because they developed a much larger IT capacity initiative by themselves. Instead, we expanded their focus from cyber crime investigation to overall cyber policing to name their organization as Cyber Police Center. For this, we constructed their offices procured hardware and software, and we trained them, and we dispatched experts to consult for organizational management capabilities. This is the facility and equipment provided. This is overall training development framework divided into manager training and train the trainer programs. We designed the various training components regarding training path, cost, goals, etc. The pictures shows various training activities in Korea and Bangladesh. For management, we identified 3 areas: infrastructure, human resources, and operation and activities. Strategies, policies, plans, SOPs, and manuals were developed for them. This project evaluated successful by the KICIF and Bangladesh government. So from the end of this year, the KICIF will grant the second phase of project with around $5 million this time. So based on the task so far, let me point out some key issues divided into national and organizational level. To be more effective, CCB project should be national, not only for law enforcement. For sustainable development, the policy may need to be financially supported, organizationally prioritized. Principles and other top-level cybercrime best practice elements should be discussed and documented as early as possible. Harmonization with existing national strategies and policies is essential, which may require much more research and feasibility study before planning. That's I always regret. Object need assessment and the need goal setting is important because we may have different goals for cybercrime. As I mentioned, international development focus moves from infrastructure to management and governance, but it's common that the recipient prepare infrastructure first, the steps capacity next, and management, the government rest. So their interests sometimes conflict between recipient to donor. For project development and implementation, forming consensus among participating stakeholders are extremely important. Cybersecurity and cybercrime are never being discussed in the same understanding. Management trainings are not easy. Is it working? And the management trainings are not easy and often neglected. It should be strategically approached. We need more R&D about CCB even in developed countries, because we don't have cybercrime statistics in any developed countries as well. For example, cybercrime statistics is not easy. So doing it in developing countries is even harder. We need cybercrime capacity assessment too, because we don't know how to assess the capability. Then how can we decide how to improve that? So we may refer cybersecurity posture, such as Global Cybersecurity Index by the ITU, but we may need a similar effort in cybercrime areas as well. We may need more specific tools such as cybercrime statistics method, digital forensic laboratory quality assurance manual to promote organizational management capability. In conclusion, today there are many CCB programs and projects consuming substantial resources for international development cooperation. However, it's not easy to assess actual results from the CCB projects because it's rarely spoken publicly. It's obvious there are many challenges to address in CCB programs. I discussed some of them today, but it must be much more complex tasks. To develop and implement the better programs and to evaluate the results objectively and to learn lessons from the improvement, we may need to share more information about them. We may need more researches. We may need to develop standardized methodologies together. I look forward to keep talking on this topic more often in the international forums for cybercrime in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. The presentation was very well organized and very informative. And thank you so much for illuminating a lot of important issues in the capacity building to combat cybercrime. Thank you once again very much for our distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable and insightful presentations. Very well, now we come to the panel discussion session. First of all, let me introduce our discussants. Dr. Hyun-Seok Jang, Professor of Gyeonggi University, Dr. Hyo Jong-song, Professor of Korea University, Dr. Hwang He, Research Fellow of Korean Institute of Criminology. The panel discussion is conducted in a way where each question will be raised by designated discussants and answered. Now, let us start with Dr. Jang. Dr. Jang, please proceed your questions. Your question is going to be to Professor McGuire, right?
Hello, I am Hyun-Seok Jang from Gyeonggi University. It is quite a pleasure for me to join in this international forum. I want to express my gratitude to the Korean Institute of Criminology. And Dr. McGuire is a well-known cybercriminologist. His insightful presentation regarding the conceptualization of cybercrime was very interesting and also quite challenging. Here, I discussed his study briefly. First, Dr. McGuire's presentation suggests that the definition of a cybercrime needs to be reconsidered. Dr. McGuire challenges that we have to consider several factors in defining cybercrime, such as universalism and particularism, and analytical and empirical aspect, and so on. While I am preparing this discussion, I looked up how cybercrime has been defined, and the definition of a cybercrime was various, and there were many different types of cybercrimes. Among them, the common definition of a cybercrime was a crime that involves a computer and a network. Cybercriminals commit crimes using computers or networks to obtain their purposes and sometimes cause harm to the computers or network system itself. And this kind of definition can be useful in categorizing currently well-known cybercrimes, such as cyber fraud, cyber stalking, cybersexual violence, hacking, and so on. However, it may not cover the unique characteristics of cyberspace, since cybercrimes are occurring in cyberspace, which has the characteristics of hyper spatiality and hyper connectivity. And Dr. McGuire also used the concept of hypercrime, considering these kind of unique characteristics. And actually, the issue of defining crime is a very complex, and also it is very difficult subject. The same behavior can be defined as a crime in a certain country, but cannot be a crime in another country. Also, certain behavior that used to be a crime may not be a crime any longer as time goes on. This is partly because the boundary between deviant behavior and clear-cut crime is ambiguous. For example, marijuana use is illegal in South Korea, but in the case of the Netherlands, it is legal. Like this, defining crime is a very complex matter. We can imagine how difficult it would be to define cybercrime because of the link between real world and cyberspace. Secondly, Dr. McGuire introduced the Web of Profit project. This project investigated the economic aspect of cybercrime, and Dr. McGuire conducted structured interviews with the actual cybercriminals and analyzed the various social media platforms and darknet sites. What surprised me about this presentation was that the estimated revenue of cybercrimes were at least $1.5 trillion. It is about 3 or 4 times bigger than the total budget of South Korea last year. It's very surprising that such a large amount of money was transacted with cybercrimes. That is why Dr. McGuire called the evolution of digital deviance within the concept of a digital economy. The economy of cybercrime is intertwined with the legal and illegal activities. It is already established as separate marketplace, according to Dr. McGuire. So overall, I think Dr. McGuire's work is an excellent study that allows us to think about the scales of cybercrime and its ripple effect on the future economy. Thanks for the very innovative research once again. I have a couple of questions for the discussion. And first, Dr. McGuire interviewed hackers and several cyber criminals. And in your opinion, roughly, what percentage of the cyber crimes they commit was discovered and traced down? And can you guess what percentage of cyber criminals actually arrested and punished? And second question is, as a criminologist, which criminological theory do you think well explains this professional hackers' cyber criminal behavior? Those two things are my questions. And once again, thanks for allowing me this opportunity. And I hope the COVID-19 pandemic is over as soon as possible so that we can meet together in the offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. He made a
Well, hello.
Okay, thank you. Yes, proceed. Yeah, please proceed your comments. Yep.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for coming along and having a listen to the follow-up discussion to the paper I gave today, which was Rethinking Cybercrime, the Evolution of Digital Deviance Within a Digital Economy. And I'd like to begin by extending my thanks to the Korean Institute of Criminology for inviting me to give this talk. I've long been trying to establish a variety of links with Korea. I think it's very important for European scholars of cybercrime to work with Korean scholars for all kinds of reasons to do with the global nature of cybercrime and beyond. I think Korea is a very interesting test bed. So I'd welcome the opportunity for pursuing this conversation. Secondly, I'd also like to thank Professor Yang for having listened to my presentation and then coming up with some thoughtful comments and questions about that. So I'd like to address those questions now. Dr. Yang asked a couple of questions, and the first question was about hackers and the likelihood of how much they're going to be caught, what percentage are them, and so on. I think the first thing to comment on was Dr. Yang's very astute observation that very often what we find within the cybercrime economy, as I call it, is a lot of service level activity. Crime is actually almost secondary. So we get suppliers, we get service workers, we get consumers all acting together in a way which is very, very similar to the legitimate economy. And in fact, that's posing serious problems for those who have to police this because of the blurring between legitimate and illegitimate activity. And because of that, as Dr. Yang points out, it is very, very difficult sometimes to actually detect cybercrime as cybercrime. We take the example of money laundering. There are many, many examples of laundering of digital money which takes place almost in a semi-legitimate way by leading banks and other providers. And distinguishing that from the cybercrime activity is extremely hard. So it's very, very difficult to detect cybercrime and cyber criminals. In the research that I did, there are a number of hackers that I spoke to and several cyber criminals across different forums. And I would estimate that of the people I spoke to, probably only about 30% of what they were doing was being detected. That's based partly on what they told me and partly on conversations I've had with the police subsequently about some of the activities that I was observing. That's obviously a very, very low number and very worrying. In terms of how many of the individuals were actually punished, well, some of the criminals that I spoke to were already in prison, and it was from them I got a lot of very, very interesting information about the kind of things they were spending their revenues on. So, but of course, they were already in prison. In terms of the overall sample of people I spoke to, and in terms of more widely the kind of arrest rates for cyber criminals, I think we all know that they're very, very low. A guesstimate, and this is based partly on the research, but also partly what I've observed elsewhere, I would be surprised if there were more than about 15% of people engaged in digital deviance and cybercrime who were actually pulled up and arrested. So that's very low, very concerning for the police, but very, very important for cybercrime researchers like ourselves to help fill the knowledge gaps that can support and enhance policing of cybercrime. The second question that Dr. Yang asked was also an extremely interesting one, and it was about criminological theory. And he asked what criminological theory I thought best addressed the way that professional hackers conduct themselves within this cybercrime economy. And I'd have to say from the outset that I don't actually think that criminology deals with this kind of thing very well at present. I mean, I've tried to develop my own approaches to this in my book, Hypercrime, where I've tried to rethink really how we as human actors engage with digital technology. And I think that has to be the starting point. And at one point we had a lot of talk about cyberspace and people acting in cyberspace. And in my presentation, I spoke about an alternative idea in a hyper-connected world. It's not cyberspace, it's hyperspace. And until we understand how technology augments and extends our body and makes it possible for us to behave and to act and to deceive and to rob others in this hyperspace, we're not really going to have a proper understanding of it. So I would argue we need to begin with a theory of hypercrime rather than cybercrime. But that being said, criminological theory itself, I guess probably the theory that I've seen applied most to cybercrime is routine activities theory, which is the theory effectively that says crime is about the exploitation of opportunities by rational agents and the absence of capable guardians to prevent them from doing that. And there's been a few papers been published on this. I'm rather skeptical myself about the efficacy of routine activities theory for several reasons. For number one, it assumes rationality, and I think one of the fundamental problems of these kind of more economic approaches, these more rational approaches, is the assumption that criminals behave rationally. In some ways, they weigh opportunities and do things very much like the rest of us, but they don't always take the most obvious opportunity. In fact, that's part of the skills and part of why they're good at what they're doing is they spot gaps and opportunities where others don't. And again, you see the blurring here with the legitimate entrepreneurial activity. Many of the more revenue-driven cyber criminals are very much like entrepreneurs within capitalism. But that doesn't mean that they're rational in the traditional sense. And I think the second problem is with this idea of a guardian or some sort of security. There isn't a comparable notion of security in cyberspace as there is to, say, if you want to rob a bank or rob a house. Cybersecurity is a much more complex issue than that. So I would be personally not comfortable with applying routine activities theory. In terms of the theories that I think would work, I mean, as I suggested, I think criminology is a bit lean in that area, and I think that one of the things that cybercrime theorists can do is to augment criminological theory. We shouldn't just think that we're talking about cybercrime. We should really adjust our perspectives to think that we're thinking about crime in general. But I think one very interesting approach, obviously, is more economic approaches to cybercrime. That would fit with my argument that cybercrime is an economy. Fortunately, that there hasn't been a lot of thinking about crime as economic. I mean, there have been some attempts again, and this led directly into routine activities theory, to think about criminals as rational consumers exploiting opportunities. But I would argue that it doesn't really capture the notion of an economy as a whole and what it means to be part of that economy. So the limited work that's been done on economic theories of crime, I think, wouldn't be appropriate. A theory that appeals to me slightly more is work done by the Chicago School. The Chicago School, of course, didn't look at digital crime and they didn't look at digital deviance, but what they did do was think about crime in a much more holistic way. They thought about cities as we know, and they thought about the zones of transitions and the onion skin model of how crime maps itself differently across the different layerings of the city. What this really amounted to is to say that cities are complex, holistic, organic spaces. And until we understand them in this more organic way and how all these different bits of cities fit together, we're not going to understand crime. And I would argue, thinking about, that the cybercrime economy points us in the same direction. Until we get away from the idea that cybercrime is about individual perpetrators breaking into, through a firewall or using malware in a clever way, and understand cybercrime in terms of a range of actors, from consumers, from service suppliers, from people who sell their skills, from people who make things, from people who harvest raw materials, I don't think we're going to get anywhere near understanding what cybercrime is about. So a more holistic approach like the Chicago School, and slightly more out of reach, if you like, and a bit more off-center. Somebody who isn't really a criminologist, but is often used by criminologists like myself, and that's the French theorist Gilles Deleuze. Deleuze was focused very much on this concept of control, the society of control, as he called it, and he very much associated the idea that we are going through changes in control, changes in the nature of the way that regulation and policing can occur because of digital technology and because of, again, the connectedness that it brings us. So he saw the way that control operates as continuous. We're monitored when we walk down the street, through our browsing habits, through the way that we engage with social media and so on. And it's not just that control agents like the police and governments are able to make use of that, cyber criminals are too. And a lot of the work that I've done, I was very surprised to see how cyber criminals were able to get information, very personal information from people to target companies or target victims. The connectedness, the continuous flow of control is as valuable for the cyber criminal as it is for law enforcement. So Gilles Deleuze, I think, is an underused reference in cybercrime theory, but I would suggest we have a look at him. I won't say any more than that, but thank you very much again for listening, and I'll look forward to talking to you all again soon.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang and Dr. McGuire. Yep. Now we're going to move into Dr. Song's discussion. Dr. Song, you have the floor.
Okay, first, thank all presenters in the current session for their great work. They're all informative and very insightful. I really enjoyed demo. Regarding Dr. Kim's work, I think that his work has many valid points about why we need better cybercrime classification and data based on that classification, which is probably one of the critical issues in cybercriminology. It's difficult by far to examine the dynamic relationship between traditional crime and cybercrime and diagnose trends and patterns of cybercrime because classification of cybercrime is somewhat vague and rarely unified despite its global impact. And only a few cybercrime cases are reported to the law enforcement agencies. So I have two questions. The first question is, what kind of criteria should be applied when we classify cybercrime? And the other one is how we can minimize the number of unreported cybercrime cases so that we estimate the scale of cybercrime more accurately. Regarding the classification issue, it seems important to break down whether a cybercrime case is close to old traditional crime or it is a novel crime distinct from any traditional crime. So for example, the classification proposed by Dr. McGuire and Dowling which was introduced earlier in the presentation, they include two different types of cybercrime, right? So first one is cyber-dependent crime, and second one is cyber-enabled crime. And actually, in 2002, Fennell also applied a similar classification, which divides cybercrimes into computer-assisted crimes and computer-focused crimes. So the advantage of this classification is that computer-assisted crimes or cyber-enabled crimes can be compared to similar traditional crimes in terms of their scales and trends. So we'll be allowed to do this kind of comparison since computer-assisted crimes can be estimated separately from computer-focused crimes that purely target computers and networks. And it would be another advantage that we can also estimate scales and trends of the computer-focused crime separately. But I think we'll face some problems if we solely rely on this dichotomous classification, because even cybercrimes belonging to the same category can have heterogeneous properties in terms of criminal orientation. So a more elaborated classification will be needed in addition to the initial categorization. So I think it would be good to have an additional classification based on orientation of cybercrime. So for a cybercrime case, for example, you may first categorize it based on the initial criteria, which is whether it is a computer-assisted crime or a computer-focused crime. And then you may categorize it again based on if it has financial orientation or non-financial, non-materialistic orientation, which is pretty corresponding to the Dr. McGuire's revenue generation. But anyway, so for the case of financial orientation, that includes cybercrime for monetary gain, while if it is the case of non-materialistic orientation, that will include probably some cyberbullying or cyber stalking cases with pure purposes of harassing others or expressing their aggression, and some writing viruses or hacking cases with particular purposes of showing off their abilities and superiority, or spreading some political messages, and some sexting and cyber pornography cases with the purpose of meeting their lust. So this kind of additional classification based on orientation seems to be helpful in solving the problem of heterogeneity within the same category that can occur when only one classification system is applied. For example, hacking or malware programming, even in the same category of computer-focused crime, some cases are directly related to financial gain, but some other cases have the sole purpose of showing off or stalking through the hacking or malware programming. And in addition, cyberbullying, cyberstalking, and sexting can also be divided into cases for financial purposes and those for meeting one's desire. So if we additionally consider this aspect of orientation of cybercrime, we can also compare the scales, and trends of cybercrime to those of traditional crimes with the same orientation, which is an additional advantage for figuring out the dynamics of cybercrime and traditional crime. So anyhow, going back to my question, I was wondering what other criteria you think would be important for better classification of cybercrime. And if you have any idea about how we can minimize the number of unreported cybercrime cases, and if you can share it with us, that would be really appreciated. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Song. Dr. Kim, you have the floor.
Song. Thanks, Dr. Song, for your comments and very interesting questions. I think Dr. Song raises very relevant issues regarding how to properly measure cybercrime. First of all, regarding the classification of cybercrime, he suggested that the very detailed for the very detailed classification, he suggested the orientation of classification based on the orientation of cybercrime, financial orientation or non-financial orientation. I think this is in line with the Dr. McGuire's revenue generation. I think the advantage of such classification, as he mentioned, would be the possibility of comparing cybercrime with traditional offline crime. I think that one more thing, I think the law enforcement who actually has to classify crime will consider such classification or financial orientation or non-financial orientation method as very straightforward. Very interesting suggestions. One thing I want to add is that classification is a means for grouping things alike. I think the perception of what is alike vary by society. As mentioned, Professor Zhang, the marijuana is illegal in South Korea, whereas legal in Netherlands. Therefore, it is the perception of what is alike vary by society. Therefore, I think it is very difficult to find a uniformly applicable standards of what is alike across different society. So, for example, I think the cyber defamation, an act of intentionally insulting or offending other individual or group on cyberspace, is rarely punished in US because American society puts more values on the freedom of speech. In contrast, cyber defamation in South Korea accounts for almost 11% of the entire cybercrime in South Korea. Therefore, we cannot simply compare two nations based on the uniform criteria until now. So I think that given the transnational nature of cybercrime, we need a kind of index crime like murder or robbery in traditional crime to compare cybercrime trends across nations. This should be also important issue in measuring cybercrime. I think the Korean Institute of Criminology can lead the international project about developing the index crime because relatively the South Korean police has a very detailed and extensive data about the cybercrime. So this should be a great project for cybercriminology. Second, Dr. Song asked about how to solve the hidden crime in cybercrime. I think I mentioned earlier the importance of a cyber victimization survey. And I think several research examined the factors related to the cybercrime victimization based on the routine activity theory, as Dr. McGuire suggested. But based on the theory, a person who frequently uses the internet is more likely to be victimized. So, since the risk of exposure to motivated offender is increased, but such a theory and victimization survey could reduce the hidden crime based on the flexibility of the victimization survey. I think it is necessary to consider ways of combining cybercrime official data based on victimization survey by completing each other's weakness. So once again, thanks Dr. Song for valuable comments and suggestions. I learned a lot. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, and thank you so much, Professor Song. Now we're going to move into the last discussant. Dr. He, you have the floor.
예, 안녕하십니까.
Hello, my name is Al Hong. I work at KIC. I am going to give my discussion in Korean. I would like to direct my discussion to Professor Jang, who talked specifically about CCB, and I did prepare some discussion remarks that I would like to present today. Right now, we are living in a modern era where ICT technology has developed and accelerated very sharply, and that has led to the rise of a cyberspace. Cyberspace is a virtual space, but within this cyberspace, different people can store their information and engage in communications and also engage in trading activities and economic activities. Because of the new technologies and the emergence of this new space, we are able to have this virtual symposium even in the era of COVID-19. However, this cyberspace has also led to the rise of different kinds of crime, such as cybercrime. And this is why we are heavily interested in trying to protect people working and enjoying themselves in the cyberspace from crime. Korea is well known as an IT powerhouse around the world. And in the case of Korea, technology has seen rapid advancements in our country. So there are still some people who are not necessarily very used to using technology. They're not very adept or very literate about technology. However, because we've seen such rapid advancements in ICT, they are forced to use these technologies. Although this technological advancement has expanded the scope of freedom for many people, they have been forced basically to use this new technology, and this has led to a new crux or a new sort of disability for them. For us to respond to the situation, as Mr. Chang pointed out in his presentation, we have to really enhance our capacity to counteract against the bad aspects of cyberspace. Dr. Jan talked about what we should do for law enforcement. However, I think that in responding to cybercrime, I think we can think about two things in particular. First is prevention of crime, and the other is investigation of crime. When we talk about crime prevention, this would fall under the territory of police activity, and for crime investigation, that will fall under the scope of judicial activity. Later, the court would try the case and bring about sentencing for that case. And so in these two different areas of cybercrime, if we want to enhance our capacity to respond to this, we have to, first of all, be very good and diligent in terms of crime prevention. And when there is an actual crime, we have to collect the data and use that to investigate aggressively so that we can lead to full prosecution. In the presentation, Dr. Zhang stressed the importance of crime prevention, that before a crime is going to be committed, the police have to be involved preemptively to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. Of course, when a crime has been committed and having to deal with that later on through the judicial court system, it is much more meaningful to prevent the crime from happening in the first place, and that is true. However, my concern is that if the police were supposed to act preemptively to try to prevent the crime, and if state power is going to be used in this space, this means that this could come at the expense of different rights or basic rights of the people in this cyberspace. So privacy rights or the right of self-determination for their information. Because in the cyberspace, a lot of their personal information can be leaked. So there is that concern. Of course, it could serve the function and purpose of crime prevention, but some people might wonder whether this could come at the expense of individual rights. Crime prevention is the unique function of the police. So in the issuance of warrants or the control of police, the judicial constraints, I don't think there is a full, sufficient judicial control over the policing activity. So I think that this is a legal challenge that I'm trying to make. But in trying to pursue CCP, my first question is, it would be very important to do a crime investigation well, but how should we do crime prevention well without infringing upon individual liberties? I think that is a very important point of view that we have to consider. So based on your experience, I want to know if you've come across any ideas or any thoughts that you could share with us in that regard. The second issue that I want to raise is that in the case of Korea, as I mentioned before, we are a powerhouse in ICT, but cyberspace does not have borders. It does not have national boundaries. It's transnational in scope. So if there are a select few countries with very high levels of ICTs and there are countries that do not, there's going to be a technology gap globally. So almost as if big companies try to go to tax havens to avoid paying taxes, cyber criminals can also do the same thing. They can take safe refuge and go to a safe haven in a country with lower digital ICT capabilities. If a country has high levels of digital ICT capacity, then they can respond to this early on. But if it's a country that does not have high levels of ICT skills or technologies, then they might not be able to respond properly to this threat. What should Korea do in response to this? In the presentation, you mentioned two things, that there could be bilateral or multilateral efforts that we can engage in. That maybe an international organization can lead efforts to build capacity in a country that lacks infrastructure, digital ICT skills, or maybe the countries where there are a lot of cyber criminals that attack Korea. I don't know if Bangladesh is one of them, but maybe we can work to enhance the levels of capacities in those particular countries. But this is not something that we can solve with just bilateral counterparty participation. Perhaps we should do more than that, and this is, again, going into some legal matters, but maybe we have to look at our country and the other counterpart country. Maybe there could be some conflict that could arise when our sovereignties clash. Of course, the intentions are good. Korea wants to help the other country engage, enhance its level of capacity for digital ICT, and that's very meaningful. But there's always going to be a technology gap between the two countries. So from that point of view, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how best we could tackle this technology gap that could exist between different countries. And with that, I would like to end my discussion.
Dr. Zhang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. He, for the considerate comment. May I proceed?
Yes.
May I?
Yes, we can hear you very well, Professor Zhang. You can proceed.
Is mic on me?
There's no problem. Everybody can hear you. You can proceed.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. He. Sorry, then I may need to change something. I changed some configuration. Sorry for that. Okay, thank you, Dr. He, for the considerate comments and very sharp questions. It's quite big question to me. You asked basically 3 questions. First of all, the preventive measures and some the personal data protection matters in the preventive measure, and lastly, the jurisdiction and international cooperation. This is so complex matters. I'm not sure if it's because I'm ignorant on these issues, but I think it's so complicated, and probably that is also serious issues may be raised during the capacity building projects. Firstly, definitely there is many different categories of the measures for cybercrime prevention. One thing we can easily adopt is some focus on the victim side and protect the victim, and they assess the vulnerability to be eliminated, and sometimes they offender the oriented and they detect it, and sometimes they disrupt the economy and the market or mitigate, and absolutely the punishment is also expect the prevention by deterrence. So as you know, actually one of my point in our presentation is that actually most of the law enforcement and international organizations as well, they prepare the retaliation or law enforcement, then more complicated preventive and intangible measure. You know that you saw a lot of Hollywood movie. They look good when they fight against criminal, right? So, but the method of law enforcement is very common and is relatively well developed. But the reason I emphasize the preventive measure is we don't know much about what is good practice for that, and there are so many variants from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I'll illustrate just one Korean case. So but anyway, I totally agree with you about the importance of the prevention. And secondly, especially when during the preventive operation, it may the data protection, personal data protection matter follow. Actually, once the target is recognized for criminal, the suspicion, and then probably criminal justice procedures will be followed. So it's make them relatively free from the legal challenges. But just simply the protective measures, there is no specific target at least in initial phase. So if they collect some personal data for the purpose, because they are not specified so much, it will have raised the concern on the breach of privacy and data protection. It's not the case in most of the country, but actually there are some of the preventive measures, as I mentioned, is intrusive, for especially recently the popularity of OSINT, open source intelligence. The intelligence use huge the accessible data, especially for the social network service and the internet surface web and dark web, and they use big data or some machine learning technology. And for that purpose, they maintain somewhat of the database. It's quite common, especially in the counterterrorism and many other areas, and including child abuse material as well. And so recently it's a trend. There are some international norms, including actual laws, to regulate the use of personal data by the criminal justice purposes. For example, in EU and Council of Europe, in case of the EU, you may heard about the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. This is very general the law to be applied in EU area. But many people don't know that they, at the same time with the regulation, they also implemented some specific data protection directive for criminal justice. But that directive, as I know, is a little loosened than GDPR because they consider the uniqueness and the needs of law enforcement in very harsh situation. So there are also some principles to be applied to use the personal data from prevention to execution of penalty. So it encompasses the entire criminal justice process. Unfortunately, in case of Korea, we don't have the specific regulations to apply only for the law enforcement. But I think it's relatively easy. We benchmark EU or Council of Europe case to adopt Korean situation because in Korea we have also very, very comprehensive general personal data protection law. So, and Korea is relatively flexible to implement the norm regarding human rights. But it might be quite different story if we try to implement the human rights awareness and actual norm or law or regulations in developing countries. As you know, in developing countries, there are many cases their protection of human rights are relatively flawed. So if you stick on it, probably they may develop some kind of border between donor and recipient, because the donor country go too much to recipient, they may feel that it's a matter of the sovereignty, that you cross over the border to breach our sovereignty issue. So there's we may develop some borderline to discuss. And we may need to develop some kind of implicit or explicit strategy to do it. It's sometimes strategic and sometimes very tactical. And my point is that it's a really, really important issue when we developed the cybercrime capacity building program for developing countries. It can be expected to be done in very short period of the time. So the CCP programs should have some intensive preparation research to address this kind of complicated issue. Lastly, you mentioned about the jurisdiction and international cooperation. As you mentioned, one of the very immediate CCP objective is to reduce the gap between the jurisdiction, between the countries. But even with the CCP, there still exists some level of gaps. It might look like offshore countries, offshore cases to actually send the money for losing taxes and other regulations for money laundering purposes, something like that. Because the enforcement of law is weak, sometimes intentionally in official countries, make a kind of safe haven for the criminals. And in cyberspace, it may raise a very complex jurisdictional issue. So as you know, originally the law enforcement authority is a type of territorial sovereignty or territorial supremacy. So if a specific, the authority do not have intent to do their job on their territory, there is we don't have many options to do it. So we developed the international cooperation in some kind of harmonized understanding or regulations. But there is something options we can do is we may support the capability if the recipient wants. And there is some exceptions which allow the law enforcement agencies can access the online material even within belong to the foreign country's territory. So the voluntarily they may do something, but considering everything, even the Cybercrime Convention allows some flexibility in this matter. And I don't think that it's immediately possible to impose the law due to the omission, the not doing from the specific jurisdiction's law enforcement. That is my understanding on this matter. Again, thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang.